fakes, propaganda, repressions. Welcome to Putin's Russia. While it is another good afternoon in Ukraine and me, Henry Keane, is explaining the hard things in his attempts for the whole free world directly from Ukraine. On May 2nd, Russian propaganda traditionally speculates on the theme of the victims of the tragedy in Odesa in 2014, a small pre-word. 48 people were killed in violent, chaotic clashes in the southern Ukrainian city of Odesa 9 years ago, when pro-Ukrainian activists stormed a building defended by pro-Russian protesters. The background of these events in Odesa was the ongoing Russian aggression in Crimea and in the east of Ukraine, as well as the Kremlin's incitement of its supporters in Ukraine to anti-state protests. Russia incited those clashes in both figurative and very literal sense of a word. The fire in the trade union house was caused by pro-Russian activists who threw bottles with Molotov cocktails and poured gasoline inside the building. Pro-Russia fighters mounted a last-ditch defense of the burning building, throwing masonry and petrol bombs from the roof onto the crowd below. Medics at the scene said the pro-Russia fighters were also shooting from the roof. At least 5 bodies with bullet wounds lay on the ground covered by Ukrainian flags as fire engines and ambulances arrived at the scene. These were violent street clashes. People died on both sides, but the first killed were pro-Ukrainian activists. It is a fact some pro-Russian activists who were forced to run or jump out of the windows of a building on fire and were rescued by their political opponents, pro-Ukrainian activists. Life is what matters for us Ukrainians. Everyone who died in Odesa 9 years ago were killed by Russian weapons and Russian propaganda. Nevertheless, look who's talking.
The Kyiv regime moved combat air forces against peaceful settlements, began a reprisal raid, essentially finishing off the last hope for the feasibility of the Geneva Accords. Dmitry Peskov, spokesman for Vladimir Putin.
It happened back then, so back then Peskov was talking about Geneva Accords. And today, in 9 years, when looking at Bucha, Irpin, Bakhmut and a brutal criminal aggression against Ukraine, it is obvious what Russian world is in general and all these Kremlin-shaped protesters actually are in particular. Russia is again trying to distort the course of events so to again incite hatred and war. However, this time Kremlin does it in favor of the domestic pro-Kremlin audience, since after 24th of February 2022, no country in the world is buying this Russian truth anymore. Putting all the hard, tragic events of 2014 in Odesa in very easy terms, today we should be looking at not what Russia says as usual, but what it actually does. Not words, but actions matter. While shedding a Hippocratic tear about those pro-Russian activists who died during the Kremlin's incited fierce clashes 9 years ago in Odesa, here is what Russia does to Odesa today. Odesa region has become one of the beloved targets for Russian attacks, missiles and drones, everything. While speculating on the tragedy of the city, Russia itself is killing Odesa residents. Why not? I mean, everything that is not Russian should be destroyed, right? It sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? ISIS terrorists demolished all the ancient monuments of Buddha, remember? Because according to their predatory, fanatical, religious point of view, everything that is not their God desecrates their God and must be destroyed. You see, the Kremlin acts in the same way. It talks about Geneva Accords when it is in accord to its own predatory strategy. And when not, Bucha happens. Kremlin kills and calls it a special operation. It lies and fakes Odesa as something that was incited by Ukraine, but the only thing incited by Ukraine was back then in Odesa and now all over the country a will to remain Ukraine and not Russia. And everything that is not Russia, that's right, should be destroyed, says the Kremlin and starts the war. Well, it better won't start something it can't finish, because this time Ukraine will finish it. Putin is a new Stalin, less powerful, less, well, everything less, but nevertheless, same cruel, lying, and same mad. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, hundreds of Russians have received fines or jail sentences of several years under new military censorship laws. But never before has the nuclear charge of treason been used to convict someone for public statements actually containing just publicly available information? Let us talk today a bit more about Alexander Karamurza, who was handed incredible 25 years in prison, a predatory high sentence previously reserved for major homicide cases, and the highest sentence for an opposition politician to date. The bulk, 18 years, was given on account of treason for speeches he gave last year in the United States, Finland and Portugal, for a man who had lobbied the West for anti-Russia sanctions such as on the Magnitsky Act against human rights abuses long before Russia invaded Ukraine. Those speeches were actually wholly unremarkable. But the prosecution cast Karamurza's words as an existential threat to Russia's safety. Wait, I mean Putin's safety. No, I mean Russia's safety. Well, whatever. In Putin's Russia, it just doesn't matter, right? This is the enemy and he should be punished, prosecutor Boris Laktionov stated during the trial, according to Karamurza's lawyer. The judge, whose own name features on the Magnitsky list as a human rights abuser, agreed, and so did every other Kremlin. Traitors and betrayers, hailed by the West, will get what they deserve. Lavrov, Russia's foreign ministry, saying, "Look, Vladimir Putin is a brute, mad animal, an outdated Soviet emperor, a thief, a murderer, a notorious thug, and an international criminal at large. See, I am a traitor and betrayer of Russia already. Can I get what I deserve, please? Say I think I deserve 2 multi-million-dollar villas on Lake Como in Italy that belong to the Kremlin leading propaganda head, Vladimir Solovyov. Anyway, in fact, Lavrov is actually, and his judges are right. We are enemies, after all, because the only thing Russia produces for the world in abundance is fear and violence, while it can't yet even produce a single computer, a single car, a single satellite without Western technology. While Kremlin's offspring live in the West under disguised names, spending millions of dollars that their fathers have stolen in Russia, driving German supercars, wearing Italian clothes, buying houses in the United States, Miami, while Alexander Karamurza goes to jail for 25 years. For Kremlin critics, the gloves have, of course, been off for far longer. Before his jailing, Karamurza survived 2 poisonings. He had been a close ally of Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered in 2015 within sight of the Kremlin. Again, within a direct sight of CCTV cameras of Kremlin. And Kremlin was like, oh, our cameras were looking the other way. What way, I wonder? The way of Russia going down, probably? Well, such reprisals were reserved for only a handful of prominent dissidents enacted by anonymous hitmen and undercover agents, as Politico notices up until now. Because the worst the foreign press corps in Russia feared was having the accreditation revoked by Russia's foreign minister. This is now changing, and very fast, after Putin last week signed into law extending the punishment for treason from 20 years to life. Anyone could be eliminated now from public life with just a stamp of legitimacy from a judge in robes. Terror internal, terrorism external. That is what Russia is these days, and Putin has a fine line to walk. No matter how you want it, Soviet-era mass campaign against traitors is quite unlikely. Arrest too many traitors and you risk shattering the image that Russians unanimously support the war. Well, do they? Russia must be cut off Crimea so that it eventually makes a gesture of goodwill towards the peninsula. This option was expressed by the representative of the main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense, Andrei Chernyak, in a comment to Army Inform. It is necessary to cut off the enemy from Crimea to make it so that Russia could not use the temporarily occupied peninsula for military purposes. Achieving this goal may need be the key to a just peace.
Kilometer-long traffic jams on the illegally built bridge from Kerch to Russia is a right reaction. The main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine strongly recommends leaving occupied Crimea while such an option is still available. Ukraine is returning and will return Crimea. Andrei Chernyak, representative of the main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, in an interview with the Army Inform.
These days, all the media and experts are talking about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Russians who moved to Ukraine Crimea after the annexation are especially concerned. The first wave of immigration was after August 9, when the first explosions took place on the peninsula's military airfields. Already in October, after the explosion of the Crimean Bridge, there was a second wave. Now, the third wave has already begun. The occupiers, strangely as it is, do not feel safe on Ukrainian territory. During a fire, an oil depot burned down in Sevastopol on April 29th. More than 10 tanks with oil products with a total capacity of 40,000 tons were burned to ashes. The oil base was hit and burned right next to the location of the Russians' 810th Marine Brigade. So it is a legitimate military objective. The Marines somehow could not protect the oil depot as well as the two anti-craft missile regiments of the Russians located in Sevastopol. In easy terms, the occupiers demonstrated their weakness and unprofessionalism. The fuel of the destroyed oil base was intended for warships and submarines from which missiles are launched at peaceful Ukrainian cities, as well as for other military equipment used in Russian aggression against Ukraine.
Panic rumors spread through the city about the inability of Russian air defense to secure its own strategic facilities, in turn apprehending the beginning of the so-called hot holiday season in the temporarily occupied Crimea. Russian servicemen started to apply for vacations specifying the desired location in mainland Russia.
Unlike Russia, Ukraine does not attack civilians. At the same time, people just should stay away from Russian military facilities in Crimea these days. As we clearly see, Russia is unable to defend and hold Crimea. Sorry for not being sorry, but it very much looks like this year's resort season in Crimea will be a bit disrupted and hot. However, Ukrainians are waiting for this. Here is, for example, the footage from Yalta city.
Are you afraid of a counteroffensive? We are for Ukraine.
Crimea is Ukrainian, you see. Was, is, and always will be. And the issue of restoring territorial integrity is only a matter of that very thing that Putin fears the most: time. It was Henry Keane on UATV State Channel explaining hard truth in easy terms for the whole free world directly from Ukraine. Stay safe and tune for more tomorrow.